Hello and welcome to NewsClick, this program with real news. We have with us today Professor Vijay Prashad, who is, as you know, well-known commentator on various issues. Vijay, good to have you with us.
Great to be here.
You know, it's also interesting what's happening in northern Syria. As you know, now the distance between the Afrin pocket and the Kobani or Rojava pocket is really about 50 kilometers. And it's being squeezed from the Kobani side. They've crossed the Euphrates, which is supposed to be a red line for the Turks, that the Kurds should not cross the Euphrates. It's also true the in-between territory is a mixture of Kurdish and Arab population. It's not a Kurdish pocket as other pockets were. And second part, and I think that's an interesting part, it seems to have American spotters and French spotters on the ground directing some of the strikes from behind. Do you think that this is also a change and the Turks have pulled back because of the Americans and the French paratroopers being there? That's what is being said at the moment.
Well, look, the Kurdish political factions have played a very smart game. Last year, they held an important meeting in the northeastern part of Syria, where they brought together various Arab factions and had a conversation about creating a new kind of federal Syria. This is very important because it sets them up, I think, for what they knew was coming, which is if you're going to join Rojava, you're going to have to deal with substantial pockets of Arabs. So I think they've thought this through. Around the same time, the Kurdish leadership created an office in Moscow. That's important. They don't have very big ambitions to make an office, say, in Washington, D.C., but they have an office in Moscow.
They are still regarded officially as terrorists in America,
exactly.
United States.
Exactly.
And it is not going to change as long as Turkey is in NATO.
Exactly. So this is a very clever move. They've insulated themselves to some extent politically by saying we have this front which is Arab and Kurd. It's not a Kurdish advance. Secondly, they are saying we've made an alliance, or at least we have an embassy in Russia. The third thing that's very interesting, and I don't think they are on the ground, American special forces, some French special forces. This is a smart thing. I mean, whether they are 10 kilometers behind the advanced troops or 2 kilometers is irrelevant. Would the Turks actually go and bomb a kilometer away from American special forces and risk the wind carrying one bomb, let's say, because that's how casualties, collateral damage takes place, and kill an American? I mean, how is that going to look if a Kurdish plane kills an American soldier on the ground? How are they going to square that? I'm sorry, a Turkish plane kills an American soldier. That's going to be a complication. So I think the Kurdish political leadership has played a very smart game. The closing off that gap is not going to be as easy as it seems. There will be a lot of fierce fighting that will be there. And I'm honestly not sure that the government in Damascus is that keen to see that gap closed. Because that then puts a new equation on the Syria that will follow, whatever that may be. I think for all the talk about autonomy to the Kurds, which was provided in late 2011, early 2012, when the Assad government said, you go ahead, we are withdrawing our state apparatus. For all the talk of that, I'm not sure that the Assad government is that serious about allowing an enclave to be created which replicates the kind of enclave that the Kurds have built up in northern Iraq. So I'm not sure that they will even allow it. I mean, I know it's happening and it's been proceeding very smoothly. But if there are contradictions north of Syria in Turkey, there are also contradictions within Syria with Damascus.
You're quite right that it is not that simple an issue. It's also true that the ISIS has helped a lot of the Arabs join the Kurds, and the SDF, or the new
Syrian Defense Force,
which has a lot of Arabs in it, is a consequence of ISIS atrocities as much of Kurdish advance in that sense, But don't also forget the picture in eastern Aleppo, that one of the pockets there is a Kurdish pocket, and the ISIS is attacking that Kurdish pocket. So you have this very contradictory alliances coming up, which we discussed earlier. But it does seem that at the moment the compact between the Assad government and the Kurds not to fight each other seems to be holding at the moment. And of course, as you said rightly, that it also means a longer term issue about what happens in terms of a federated Syria or not. But it does seem that there is at least a change between Turkey and Syria with respect to northern Syria, which earlier was almost under Turkish protection. Other part of it in Syria is that the march towards Raqqa, which was supposed to have taken place across the Iraqi border, has failed. The American one. And the one they wanted to Jordan, it appears the Russians have bombed that. So it seems that on that side there is also not much of a gain that the Americans are able to do. Only gains the Kurds have made and what the Assad government is doing.
It's a fair picture. I mean, the march to Raqqa is going to be complicated, as complicated as the march to Mosul. There are all kinds of questions to ask. How did Mosul fall so easily? When the Americans had, a complete visual picture of what was going on and ISIS is moving towards Mosul, why were they not bombed on the way there? I mean, there are serious questions that I think a historian needs to ask.
Similar to Raqqa.
Similar to Raqqa. It was clear they're moving. So, I mean, a historian perhaps will ask these questions. Right now, to ask these questions is to open cans of worms where one looks idiotic asking them, because people say, well, what are you saying? That the Americans wanted ISIS to take Raqqa, or they wanted ISIS to take Mosul? I'm not saying that. I'm just curious. I'd like the United States government to reply to the question. If you have such great visual maps of what's happening, and you saw these ISIS white Toyota trucks moving towards Mosul, why did you not do anything? It's the same question the Russians asked earlier. You see the oil tankers moving, why didn't you do anything? I think this is a serious and good question. But to take back a major city is not as easy as it seems. See in Fallujah. I mean, initially there were news reports saying that the Iraqi army has entered Fallujah. Did the army really win? Or did the ISIS fighters withdraw, allow the army to come in and then ambush them, which is what's been happening? So it's not going to be as easy as it appears. And aerial bombing a city with a substantial civilian population is an intolerable situation, as I think the people of Aleppo are finding, because they are being hit from the air, a lot of it from the Syrian army, Syrian Air Force, and that has intolerable consequences for the people living there. They are not all rebels, there are lots of civilians.
Do you think that there is a change or shift between the Russia-America relations in Syria? Or do you think this is still, America is still where it was, that Jabhat al-Nusra should not be bombed because it is in bed with our allies and we cannot separate the Nusra from our allies, so don't bomb either?
I mean, look, the best example of how to understand Secretary of State Kerry is that there was a donors meeting, an aid meeting actually, an aid meeting in Istanbul, and during the tea break, Secretary of State Kerry was getting himself, I think, a cup of coffee, and two aid workers sort of rushed up to him and they said, well, why aren't you doing enough against the Assad government? That's what they said. And Kerry, in an irritated way, turned to them and said, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to bomb the Assad government? He said, do you mean we should go to war against Russia? That was the most plain-spoken statement of where things lie. Russian intervention has checkmated any attempt that the West might have made to bomb, which is why it was stunning that 51 members of the American diplomatic corps would write a letter saying bomb Assad. I mean, what are they thinking? The correlation of forces has changed completely. It's the first time, by the way, that Russia has intervened into a country against the West since perhaps 1979. Because after all, even in Angola, it was Cuban troops that went in to go and fight against the right wing in Angola. It wasn't the Russians directly. So this intervention is quite significant. It suggests that, that multipolarity is back on the table.
Right wing and South African.
And South Africa. In fact, the defeat of South Africa, the apartheid South Africa might have taken through Quinto Kunivale, the battle in 1987. But in this situation, I think it's quite clear that the Russians not only have been invested in the Iranians and others, but they have a military presence in Syria with surface-to-air missile batteries on the ground, and therefore any quick raid is going to be really impossible. It's a real challenge. And in that case, the problem for any easy understanding of you can't hit this group, you can't hit that. See, when Kerry said we've got zones, we're not telling about people, these are all equivocations. What they're saying is in public, we don't want to say that the Russians or whoever can hit anybody, because that's essentially the status quo. We don't want to admit that, but we can't also say they shouldn't do it. Because if we say they shouldn't do it and they do it, then we demonstrate that we are not strong. So these statements cannot be taken seriously. What this what actually indicates the position is that the Russians and the Americans are in a position of somewhat concord on what to do, but also discord on what to do. But nobody can move an agenda against each other fully. And in the middle of this, the tragedy is the bleeding of Syria continues. I mean, there is no hope of peace. The ceasefires keep breaking down. There is no projected pathway to go towards even a really consolidated peace for the country which doesn't have ISIS in it. There is no. So this kind of logjam between, on the one side, the Russians and the Americans, on the other, the Iranians and the Saudis, these continuing gears that are grinding without finding, the mutual teeth, is basically making a mess of the Syrian people's ability to survive.
So thanks, I think, Vijay, for this discussion. We will continue to interact with you on the West Asia issues, or what we call the West Asia issues, what the West calls the Middle East. So thanks a lot, and hope that you will be with us again.